Hello and welcome once again to God With Us Live. Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, excited as always to be here with you to talk about a lot of the beautiful things going on in our Eastern Catholic churches. Originally, I started this interview that you'll listen to the first part of today, and plan to release it as one episode. But there are just so many beautiful stories, so much beautiful content from my guest, Father John Sianchuk, who's the director of the shrine to Blessed Vasyl Velychkovsky up there in Winnipeg. I wasn't ready for that, but hello and welcome once again, God With Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, excited as always to be here with you to find out more beautiful things about our Eastern Catholic churches. The following interview actually started as one show, and then as we got into the second half, I realized that this would make a beautiful two-parter, just because there is so much beautiful information, so much wonderful information that I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to listen to it. And I know sometimes with podcasts, once they get to a certain length, people have a hard time planning enough time to listen to the full episode. So we're actually going to split this into our first two-part interview. Just so many wonderful, beautiful stories that Father John was able to share with us. So this will be the first half of the interview, and then next week we'll release the second half of the interview. Just so many wonderful, beautiful things about this martyr of the church and this shrine, this martyr's shrine that we have here in North America. Really such a blessing and a privilege that I wanted to make sure that we shared all of it and everybody had a chance to listen to it. So here's part one.
Glory to Jesus Christ, and welcome to this week's episode of God With Us Live. Every week, we're joined by men and women, monastics, clergy, and laity, exploring exciting and inspiring ways to live our Eastern Catholic faith today. Your host is Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, a husband, father, and deacon of the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of St. Nicholas. And now, here's Father Deacon Nick.
Hello and welcome once again, God With Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, excited as always to be here with you to find out more wonderful things about our Eastern Catholic churches. Obviously, if you've been following the news over the past few years, there's been a lot of renewed interest in Ukraine and things going on in Ukraine. A lot of the challenges faced by the Ukrainian people, and anyone who's any even light student of history knows that those struggles have gone on for a long time, but that the Ukrainian church is very resilient, especially the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and continues to flourish despite the challenges. Today, very excited to talk about one of the great martyrs, one of the great new martyrs of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Blessed Vasyl Velychkovsky, who some people might know and some might not. His shrine is actually in North America, in Winnipeg, in Canada. So very excited to talk about him and also have sort of a personal connection with Blessed Vasyl, as he blessed the crosses that are on top of our parish in Minneapolis, St. Constantine, and actually the first Divine Liturgy he celebrated in North America was right across the street as our current church building was under construction at St. Maron's, Maronite Parish in Minneapolis. So feel a sort of a personal connection there with Blessed Vasyl, and very excited to share more about him with our listeners, and especially excited for our guest today, who's the director of the shrine in Winnipeg there for Blessed Vasyl, Father John Sianchuk, who's a Redemptorist priest. And Father John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to share with you about our dear Blessed Vasyl Velychkovsky. Yes, it's good to be here. As you mentioned, he was in your hometown or home city of Minneapolis in August of 1972, and so we have a connection to him. You have a connection, I have a connection to him, very much.
There you go. So if you wouldn't mind telling our listeners just a little bit about yourself. Of course, we're going to talk about Blessed Vasyl a little bit later in the show, but first I thought we'd find out just a little bit about you.
Sure. I'm born in Canada. My grandparents came over from Ukraine, but as a young child, I really was kind of attracted to serving the church. My father was a cantor, so we were in church quite a bit. And then when the time came, as I was in my high school years, I started investigating and kind of got called to investigate it more into our minor seminary in St. Vladimir's College in Roblin, Manitoba. And that was run by Redemptorists. And so I at the end of that, I joined the Redemptorist congregation. It's a worldwide congregation with an Eastern Rite branch in it, which means that we live in the Eastern Rite, we worship in the Eastern Rite, our houses are in the Eastern Rite. So that's kind of a difference from some other orders that have Eastern Rite priests in them, but they don't have their own separate communities. So we have our own Eastern Rite communities in the Redemptorist congregation. So I joined over 50 years ago, and in that time, the Redemptorists are a missionary order known for the extraordinary preaching, and also we have a heart for the poor, for those most abandoned. So those two things attracted me a lot, and I spent most of my priesthood, a good portion in formation, that is, forming others in vocations, teaching in the high school for 5 years, and then in our major seminary, that is House of Studies, for almost 12 years there. And meanwhile, giving retreats and missions and workshops. I do a lot of stuff with our Ukrainian Catholic music, especially in English, but also in Ukrainian. So all that kind of stuff has been happening. And I would say since 1990, that was my first trip to Ukraine. I've been going to Ukraine almost every year. At first doing kind of workshops for our Ukrainian Redemptorists who were just coming from out of the underground. So I got to know the Ukrainian church quite a bit, and even got to know a bit about Vasyl Velychkovsky from Ukraine in those years. And once Vasyl Velychkovsky was beatified, I've been there almost every year, sometimes even twice a year. At first collecting material about him and learning more about him through people that knew him personally. And so that's been kind of my life. So it's been a full life, and it's still going on, still moving on. So, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
You mentioned something there that I've heard from a few other priests, but if you wouldn't mind telling our listeners a little bit about the kind of unique experience that priests from North America, from the West, had when they were able to return to Ukraine and kind of help the church come out of the underground. Could you talk maybe a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. It was, I would say it had a double thing. We from the West thought that we have to you can say, bring those who were in the underground back to, up to the 1990s and post-Vatican and all that stuff. But what was discovered was that, they had a spirituality that was much more profound than what we had, even, you can say. And they were coming out of a church that was persecuted and therefore had been formed in a different way, a very living faith. So what was exciting for me was that you come, just different mentality. For example, to give a mission in Ukraine, here in Canada, you have to at least advertise for 3 weeks, if not more, even a month and a half.
Right.
So, to get a crowd. There, they will announce Sunday morning, tonight we're starting a mission. A missionary from Canada has come here. We'll start today and we'll go on for the next 7 days. And it's a packed church.
Wow.
And the churches were packed and people outside. And I remember my first experience there, my first Sunday there, and one of our Redemptorist priests got me to, this was a small church, people mostly outside, and he asked me to preach. So I preached like North America, around 7 to 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes. I finished, and he looks at me and says, "Why so short? We preached 45 minutes here." So it was like that kind of experience and the people were standing right through. There was no benches. They were standing through this, and there was no question of, God, it's too long. So it was like, there was a whole different experience of a living faith. It was very exciting, and I saw it grow, and I saw it, and it's still growing to some degree. Yeah, it's a very alive faith, because people, I think, have their priorities, maybe at least in those days, rather straightforward. They knew who Christ was and knew what it means to belong to church, what it means to have faith. So that's, and we'll hear the story right away. A lot of that has to do with Blessed Vasyl. We'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Well, that's a great segue into my next question, which is it's great to hear about all of those experiences you had, but obviously a big part of your life has also been Blessed Vasyl. So, would you mind telling us how that kind of started? How you first
Sure.
kind of knew about him, how became aware of him, and how that kind of grew?
Sure. Well, there was several stages. The first stage was I was still a seminarian when he first arrived to Canada in 1972. He arrived in June, and in July he came to our monastery in Yorkton, where I was. We're having summer classes from our older priests, and so he came there, and we you can say had an evening with him as a seminarian. We sang for him, said some verses and greetings, and I played the bandura, so I played a song for him, and he was sitting there with his, sitting, and he had a cane in his hands and kind of nodding his head.
Wow.
I then as is customary in our community, we'd have what's called a gaudiamo, say an evening after that of some drinks and some like a soiree. We have some meats and cheeses and just socializing with each other. And he was there too, and he wasn't doing much. Maybe I don't even know if he was drinking at all. He just sort of sat there. But what I recall was one of the older priests came up to me and said, because what I saw was a man crying a lot, quiet, pensive. And so this priest came to me and says, Father, wasn't Father, he said, Father, he said, John, because I wasn't a priest yet. He said, John, he was a great missionary. I said, oh, because I didn't know anything about him, I just heard about him. But so it was this kind of sense that there was someone that I know that I didn't know. And in fact, when he went later that summer, we had an ordination in Ethelbert, not mine, but another fellow priest. And that's the same day that Blessed Vasyl went to Minneapolis to bless the crosses. So I really never saw him again. And he died a year later on also the ordination of another fellow priest that became ordained just before me. And so we heard of him. After that, I heard stories about him. So that was my first kind of encounter with him. Of course, he dies. He's buried in Winnipeg. And yearly we'd go to the cemetery to pray for our own priests there, and we'd have a panegida, a prayer service at his grave site, and you kind of, so here he is, and he has on his tombstone confessor of the faith. So I knew he was suffering. Some of our priests wrote a book on his life after that. So that too, I read the book, kind of got to know him a little bit that way. But it really wasn't until I was going to Ukraine, and in the early 90s, and some of the priests who were taking me around, and they, spoke. They showed me where he lived in Lviv. Took me into his apartment where he lived. And it was kind of very kind of interesting. And I wish I would have known then what I know now. That is that I would be involved with his life, because these were priests who knew him very well, lived with him, worked with him, and whatever stories they gave me, that's what I have. But I would have asked him many more questions. But then once he was beatified in 2001, then I happened to be the provincial of our community in Winnipeg here, of the Redemptorists in Canada. So it fell upon me to do something. You can't just leave the relics in the cemetery. So they're usually brought to a church. So it was my responsibility to arranging where it would be brought, preparing a place for it, and the whole process of the transfer of the relics. Then he was here for 1 year in Winnipeg. Oh, a year and 2 weeks. Okay, so in North America, Winnipeg, Canada, he was mostly in Winnipeg, but he went through the States and Toronto and Edmonton, and almost nobody knew about him. So it was as important as having his relics in the church. was as important to have a museum to tell his story. So we have the 2 rooms in our church, a museum and a chapel. And so to tell the story, of course, I had to learn the story. The book was okay, but then you find that there's all these people in Ukraine who knew him. So I started going yearly with the person who was the administrator of the shrine, and did all kind of interviews and received all kind of artifacts and some very precious artifacts. And so that was how I got to know him very well. And so I've been learning about him ever since, to this very day. I'm still learning about his life.
Well, very, very cool, and pretty interesting there that your first experience was seeing the man in person, right? And it was only after years later, right?
That's right.
You got to learn more about him.
Who would have known that I would have to be in military?
So I suppose this is as good a time as any. But for our listeners who might not be familiar, like you said, when the beatification happened, and sort of following on that, still a lot of people here in North America didn't necessarily know who he is. And I know some of our listeners aren't Ukrainian Catholics, and so would have probably zero idea who he is. So for those who don't, could you kind of give us an idea of who he was?
No, I'll give you a short synopsis of his life a bit. He was born in 1903, so 120 years ago. Well, more than 21. And he was born to a priestly family, as we know in our Eastern churches. We have married priests, so his father was a priest. His both grandfathers were priests. On his father's side, it was down for several generations of priests down to the 1800s. There were Velychkovskys that were priests that were in his lineage. As a young man, he entered he was part of the First World War. So he actually entered what was called the Ukrainian riflemen. It was in Ukraine was Sianchuk. He was part of that he entered at 15. He was too young, but he was big for his age, so they allowed him to be part of the army. And he says that I'm grateful that I never fired a shot, never killed anyone, and myself was not wounded. But he was on the front lines, and he was, so he describes some of those things. And part of that was that he was captured and was told to dig his own grave. There he was with a shovel in his hand at the age of 17. Digging his own grave, and the soldier is with a pistol, ready till it's deep enough. And by God's grace, some other officer came by and said, no, he's going to prison. So he was taken to prison, and in that prison, by giving the officer some cigarettes, the officer somehow either knowingly or unknowingly left the door open, and he just escaped from the prison. Escaped, ran away, got to Lviv, and so eventually he was caught again and was taken to his hometown for the court case. But meanwhile, the war finishes and he enters the seminary. But it's important because in that prison, he writes about it in his book that he discovered, I would say, maybe his vocation, because he says, I realized that the best way I could defend my country was to become a soldier for Christ. Instead of, and so he made it. When he finished this whole thing, he entered the seminary thinking he'd become a married priest. But in the seminary, he had, during his diaconal, before diaconal, the retreat, he got the calling to be a celibate. So he asked Metropolitan Sheptytsky whether he can ordain him as a celibate, and Sheptytsky said, "No, wait." And he has to ask him 3 times. It was like 3 weeks or 3 or whatever it was. It was a bunch of time. He asked 3 times. On the 3rd time, Sheptytsky said, "Okay." So ordained him to a diaconal. And then that summer, through the intercession of his auntie, who was Sister Monica, a Basilian sister, who knew the Redemptorists in Lviv, she brought him to the Redemptorists, and without asking to be part of the Redemptorist superior for the scribers said, "Welcome, Vasyl. You can join the novitiate in 2 weeks' time. Go home and prepare your stuff and come back." So he said, It must be the providence of God. I didn't even ask to be, and because all his uncles were Brazilian priests, and he knew the Studaites a bit, but he didn't know the Redemptorists. But he joined, and of course he was a great missionary, so he fit in very well with the Redemptorist congregation, and so he became our blessed, a Redemptorist. And so as a Redemptorist, he worked mostly as a missionary, that is giving missions, both in Volyn area, which is northern Ukraine, by Belarus and Poland, and in the western Ukraine. Many missionaries, many missions and retreats, looked after the poor, and that all went well until the Second World War began, and the Soviets came through Ukraine in 1939 on their way to Poland, and it was already communist control time, and he had to well, in the city of Ivano-Frankivsk, where he was the ihumen, the superior of the monastery, every year they'd have this huge procession on the Mother Perpetual Help at the end of June. And he was warned not to have it because it was already communist-controlled area. But he said, we had the service by the grotto, and there was like 20,000 people there. And I know the bishop said, don't do it, but they all want a procession. So he processes through the streets, and the Soviets were there, and they were like wanting to stop it, but the men apparently were kind of stronger, and they did not stop it. So it happened. But anyhow, he got called in after the whole thing, and he describes that's being in front of was called the NKVD, the former KGB. How they began to beat him, as he said, all I was doing was sitting on the chair with my rosary in the hand, and all I could hear was the Hail Mary in my heart while they were beating me and yelling at me. And then, the women outside started to protest his arrest, and they got scared of that, and so they released him. So he was there probably for a day or two, not in prison, but just in custody. So that was his first kind of experience, or maybe second experience, of kind of being persecuted. Until 1945, when the war finished and all of our bishops were arrested, and he was on the list. And that August, they came for him in Ternopil, and it's a interesting story there too of how he was escaping them by giving small missions in various villages, and they had come before, but he was never at home. But this day, August the 7th or 6th, it was August 6th, 1945, they came to the monastery in Ternopil. And he, Brother Vasyl says, there's a brother there, also the same name, said that they're here. So he escapes to the garden, and he's, looking, where can I run? Where can I run? The soldiers on the, military on the streets, maybe to the neighbors. Then he puts his hand in the pocket and pulls out the rosary and begins to Hail Mary. He says, what am I doing? Why am I escaping the cross? So he went back to the house and said, I am Velychkovsky. And so they arrested him, and they took him in just at nighttime, gave him a piece of paper to sign to say you reject or didn't renounce, rather, better word, renounce the Catholic Church, and you joined the Russian Orthodox Church. And he said, no, never. He said, well, you better think it over. We can put you against the wall and shoot you. You can do whatever you want with me. My answer is final. No, never. And so he was taken to prison and spent over a year in interrogations, and then was sentenced. Finally, they found a little passage he wrote in a prayer, "Save us from the Red Horde," and that was enough to make it anti-Soviet. Those words, Red Horde, and for that he got the death penalty to be shot. So he was on death row for 3 months, and while on death row, he what did he do in the prison? It was a cell full of criminals. He was the only non-criminal there, and the rest were rapists, murderers, thieves who were also on death row, and so he evangelized them. In those 3 months, he had a mission for them in that prison cell. Confessed them all. Imagine that. You're on death row, you're a hardened criminal, and you receive forgiveness, and then
Wow.
received the Eucharist. So it was like just a great, for him, he said that was one of my best apostolic experiences, was to be on death row. But his name came up, and so he was going to leave. He left his stuff. He says, if anyone gets back to Lviv, tell them that Father Vasyl was shot for the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith. But instead of being shot, they took him upstairs and changed his sentence to 10 years of imprisonment in the far north in a place called Vorkuta, which was above the Arctic Circle. So he spent first a year and a half in a place called Kirov, and then took him to Vorkuta, where he spent the rest of his 10 years up there, mostly up there. And even in there, he evangelized. He had the divine liturgy always in the barracks on his bunk. Occasionally, he'd have it in the mine shafts. It was a coal mining area. So we got witnesses who were with him in those liturgies and talking how holy it was, And in the mine shaft, he's in his prison clothes, dirty, sooty, and there he pulls out a spoon from his pocket, which became his chalice, and put some bread on there. Took some wine made from raisins that he had received from home, and that was, he had the Eucharist there quietly with the prisoner said that was one of the most profound moments of his life, to have liturgy in the mine shaft with him in this kind of, we know Eastern Rite, we have vestments, bells, and singing, and all that. Here was just quiet, profound presence of being in the presence of God and letting God feed you and heal you. So that was so we got some beautiful stories from his prison life, and he came back, and just very briefly here, he will talk more about later on this. He discovers a church that is destroyed, and he had the courage to begin and to form what was known after as the underground church. He said, if you can have liturgy in the mine shafts, on the bunk beds, why can't we have liturgies in homes, in the forests, in the cemeteries, to gather where we can gather, and that's what he did, because the priests were all scared. They were still being arrested.
Right,
so he began to do that work, and as priests came back from the prisons, he encouraged them, and he had a whole little gang of priests, and eventually he was named as a bishop in 1959, but there was no bishops in Ukraine to ordain him. So it wasn't until 1963 when Metropolitan Yosef Slipy, who was 18 years already in prison, because all of our bishops were put in prison, and most of them died in prison. And so Cardinal Slipy, then Metropolitan Yosef Slipy, was being released from prison camps to go to Vatican II. Pope John the 23rd interceded, so that President John Kennedy, and they released him. And on his way to Rome, in a Moscow hotel room, he calls Blessed Vasyl. He wrote a letter, telegram to him, and says, "Come to Moscow hotel room 624, and I bring empty luggage. I have something to pass on to you." And what was to be passed on was the ordination or the consecration to the episcopacy. And he described that as he walks into the hotel room, Metropolitan Yosef ushers everyone out and says, and then tells Father Vasyl, kneel down here. With one foot against the door, Metropolitan Slipy puts his hands on Blessed Vasyl and ordains him there and then, in a short form, of course, to the episcopacy, and passes on his own staff to him as the crosier, as the bishop's staff. He passes it on. His staff was a walking stick. That became the symbol of authority being passed on to Father Vasyl, now Bishop Vasyl. So he, coming back, ordains many men to the priesthood, ordains Bishop Volodymyr Sternuk to the episcopacy. So the line of episcopacy continues. And one can say, if it were not Blessed Vasyl, the church might have died in Ukraine. And so he kind of carried on both that physical of providing the church with priests and also his own spirit of enlivening the faith. He was untiringly in his work, untiringly. And then in 1969, he was again arrested. They had house searches and stuff. They were arresting priests then to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Lenin. Okay, I think it was Lenin's death. Okay, so they had a big search, but now the church should be dead, but it's not. So let's again arrest the priests again. So they arrested Father Vasyl, and this time he got 3 years of imprisonment in Komunarsk, which is today's eastern Ukraine near Luhansk. And that was just more, you could say, even though it wasn't as harsh physically as the coal mines, but this time it was in a psych hospital where they administered to him drugs. As we know, the Soviets or the communists are known to poison people. So that's what they did. They gave him drugs to weaken his heart, his nervous system, and in the end they gave him a drug that would kill him. And they knew it was a slow-working drug. So he lasted another year. They released him from prison and exiled him. So he could not return back to Lviv, to Western Ukraine. And he came first to see a sister in Yugoslavia, then to Rome to see Cardinal Sleepy at that time. He was the Metropolitan Vasyl Sleepy, and to see Pope Paul VI. And our Metropolitan here from Winnipeg, Maxim Hermaniuk, who was also a Redemptorist and knew him personally, went to Rome, and that June in 1972 brought him to Canada. And he lived his last life here in North America and died on June 30th, 1973. And was buried here in Winnipeg. So that's kind of his short form of his life. The more I get to know him, the more it is exciting to know this great man of our church. Really, I think a crucial man, and just, I would say, still being discovered, by our church. Because why? Because he's his, you can say, I wouldn't say greatness, but maybe greatness, happened during the time of the persecution, which means that even people around him did not know that he was a bishop. We met many sisters who said, I wasn't aware that he was a bishop, because never wore bishop's robes. He was just in civies, and put the petrechil on to have services, and so depending on circumstances, but very few knew that he was a bishop. So even in Ukraine, they didn't know who he was, and it was not this famous bishop because he was just in the underground church, and so that's sort of his life. And of course, now he is beatified, and so he's known not only among us but among the whole world. They know him.
Yeah, absolutely. What a life! What a life! Once again, thank you so much for listening today here on God with Us Live. Excited to bring the first half of this interview with Father John Sianchuk to you. Father John is the director of the Shrine of Blessed Vasyl Velychkovsky up there in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Excited to bring more awareness about this shrine and about this great martyr of the church. Once again, such a powerful interview. I felt it was important to split it over 2 episodes just to make sure everyone listened to the whole thing. Next week, Father John shares some amazing stories from Blessed Vasyl's life that were so extremely powerful to me, and I hope they are for you as well. So once again, make sure to subscribe if you're not currently subscribed to God with Us Live, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts. We're there. And before we're done for the day, don't switch off the podcast yet. Still have our Saint of the Week. And then once again, join us next week to hear the second half of this powerful interview with Father John. God bless.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Do you know which saint held up a collapsing roof with his prayers? Saint Akakios was born in the Armenian city of Melitene to pious parents who had been unable to have children for a very long time. In thanksgiving for God blessing them with a child, they dedicated their son to the service of God and placed him under the guidance of their bishop, Saint Eustrichios. This holy bishop was a staunch defender of the faith against all heretics and passed this devotion to orthodoxy on to his young disciple. Saint Akakios was ordained a reader, then a little bit later a deacon, and eventually a priest. He was known as a great teacher of the faith, both for children and adults. After the death of Saint Eustrichios, Saint Akakios was chosen to take his place as the Bishop of Melitene. He tended his flock with great care and was renowned for his faith, humility, and miracles. Once, during a great drought, he held the Divine Liturgy in an open field, and the rain began to fall before liturgy was even finished. Another time, during a great flood, the saint set a stone on the edge of the riverbank, and the rising waters never went past it. In Thanksgiving, the saint ordered a church to be built on one of the islands in the river, dedicated to the Most Holy Theotokos. Unfortunately, the builders he hired were either not very good at their trade, or they disliked the growing Christian population. Shortly after the new church was consecrated, the dome began to crack and crumble during Divine Liturgy. People began to run out of the collapsing building, fearing for their lives. But Saint Akakios calmly exited the altar and quoted the psalm, saying, "The Lord is the defender of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Struck by these words and the humble faith of their saintly bishop, the people remained in the church through the end of Divine Liturgy. After everyone had left, as Saint Akakios walked out the front doors of the church, the dome collapsed, and Saint Akakios decided to hire another group of men to rebuild the church. Saint Akakios also participated in the Third Ecumenical Council, defended the two natures of Christ, and reposed peacefully in the Lord after having served as a devout bishop of Melitene for many years. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Join us again next time when we learn more about the lives of these holy men and women. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of God with Us Live. Make sure to tell a friend or two about us and subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to follow God with Us online on Facebook and Instagram for even more great content about the Eastern Catholic Churches. And don't forget to check out all the other great Eastern Catholic podcasts at godwithusradio.org, where faith meets life. God with Us Live is a production of God with Us Radio, hosted, produced, and edited by Nick Modelski. Send us a message at info@godwithusradio.org.